My name is Lila Nordstrom. I'm 40 years old, and on 9/11, I was a student at Stuyvesant High School, which is about 3 blocks from the World Trade Center. And in 2006, I started an organization called StuyHealth that advocates for the students of the 9/11 cleanup.
That's amazing, and I wanna get into that, but I'd love to hear just a little bit on the day of your experience, and then, like, how did you get into what you're doing now with StuyHealth?
On 9/11, I was in school. It was the third day of school, and I was on the 10th floor of Stuyvesant High School overlooking the World Trade Center. So we kind of watched the events unfold while we dealt with some indecision about whether it was safe for us to evacuate or not. So we ended up evacuating about like a minute before the second tower fell. And we got all these contradictory, announcements in between that time that, where the FBI was like coming into the principal's office and being like, they should leave now. And then being like, no, definitely don't leave. It's not safe to leave. And so I am a lifelong asthmatic. And so I had kind of worked my way to where I would be near the exit when they finally called for us to evacuate. Because I suspected once I saw the number of people that were streaming uptown that we would be evacuating. And so I was sitting on the third floor on the northern side of Stuyvesant right after the second tower fell. That was when I was like, I got to get out. I got to get out of the
Yeah.
10th floor and like be near the door. And as soon as they called for us to evacuate, I just like ran outside and stepped outside like the second that the second tower started to fall. And so I ended up in this like stampede of people running from the second tower. Luckily, we stayed about half a block ahead of it. So I didn't end up in the dust cloud, which I know has caused a sort of second type wave of health problems in and of itself. And I ended up kind of walking uptown sort of aimlessly. We were just told to run north. Our school didn't really have good instructions for anywhere to go or where to meet or
Right.
anything. And I ran into a teacher up there. She and I started walking together and kind of gathered students as we went. And then we walked up to about 59th Street, which was long past my own house. I had been hearing on the radio that there were all of these planes in the air and they were going to hit every building, and that, the Empire State Building, which was very near to my house, was going to be hit. And so I was just like, I need to get out of Manhattan. And so I started walking with a friend from Queens, and we ended up walking to Queens. I think we walked about 10 miles, and then I spent the
Oh
night
my
in
god.
Astoria that night. First time ever going to her house. It was like a friend of mine from homeroom that had been sort of like a casual friend for years, but we had never hung out outside of school. And suddenly I was like on the most significant day of our lives, I was like in her living room with her mom and her brothers, like
Are you still
figuring out what
friends?
to do. We're still in touch. I we're
Yeah.
not we never really like resumed that level of intimacy after the events. But she's like such an important part of this like very significant moment in my life. So I still sort of stay vaguely in touch with her just because of that.
Yeah, wow. And then I read in an article you guys ended up going back, like, what was, like, October 9th or something like that?
Yeah,
Is that
I would say the real story of Stuyvesant as a unique experience actually starts with the cleanup, because Stuyvesant is this magnet school in New York City that is very hard to get into. And so there was a lot of discussion about what the city was going to do with the students at Stuyvesant. It's quite a large school. The students come from all over the city to go to it. And our building was being used as a command center for the cleanup effort. But it became clear after a few weeks that they were not going to find many survivors in the rubble. And so the cleanup effort started to shift towards more of like an actual cleanup as opposed to a rescue effort. And so suddenly they were like, we got to send everyone back. You hear this a lot, I think, in the time of COVID as well, where it's like kids need their routine back and they need normalcy. And so we got to get them back. And so we had been attending school at a school in Brooklyn and kind of on split days. Like we were basically attending fake school where we would go to class for 20 minutes and then like hang out. And then, we went to school at like 1 p.m. and left at 5 or something like that. A great schedule. Highly
Yeah,
recommend to
amazing.
any teenager. But suddenly there was all this pressure to get us back, in part because it's this very competitive school, and parents were excited to get us back because they thought our academics were suffering, and the city was excited to get us back because they had made these announcements that it was safe for people to resume work downtown. And it was like very much obvious that it was not safe to resume work downtown if you like used your eyes and your nose. Like it smelled wrong, the air was very thick, there was smoke everywhere. You could even smell the smoke in Brooklyn. And, I think as early as the 14th, the EPA is saying, just get back to work. It's the air. There's no long-term health consequences to be found here. Don't worry about anything. And then I think on the 18th, Giuliani makes the same announcement. And so there was a lot of pressure to get people back downtown, there's this concern that like Wall Street won't survive these attacks and what will happen to the US economy and what will we all do? And so there suddenly is this push to get Stuyvesant to go back downtown that at the time, I don't know if I made this connection, but I think even at the time we were talking about this seemed connected to the attempts to get people to go back to work downtown. And so we returned downtown on October 9th, which is less than a month after the attacks, but it's also immediately after the emergency crews had evacuated our, building itself. And it's like in the midst of this enormous cleanup project where the part of Battery Park City that Stuyvesant is in is not even open to the public yet. We had to go through 5 police checkpoints to get into the building. We had to go past all these news crews, and these news crews are going on and on about how great it is that like things are returning to normal in Lower Manhattan. So it was very clear that we were sort of being used as a media ploy.
Hmm.
And that experience informed how a lot of other schools in the area ended up approaching their returns. So many of them went back too early, and schools that were just outside that immediate zone never even really left, so they also, I think were not treated fairly in this situation. But a lot of the schools that shared an immediate area with Stuyvesant, and there were a number of them, there was a middle school and an elementary school just across the street from Stuyvesant, they all pushed their returns back after witnessing our experience, because like immediately people started to get like headaches and nosebleeds, and there was like everyone had a cough, and like the
Wow.
line at the nurse's office was like so long that you couldn't even get in. And this is all getting reported in the New York Times. It's not like it's a secret that's only happening inside of the school. And I think what really kind of tipped the balance was immediately after the parents association, which had been assured that a certain number of safety precautions were going to be taking place, found out that most of them had not actually happened. So there were supposed to be these like HEPA filters in the school. They were supposed to clean the vents. They were supposed to clean the school itself. Um, they basically like mopped the school, and then they were like, "That seems fine."
Oh my god.
And it turned out, that there were not special filters. They had not even really vacuumed in a lot of, the theater was carpeted that and had fabric on the seats, and that fabric and carpet was not replaced until 2014. The vents in the school had not been cleaned. They were inches thick with World Trade Center dust, and they did not clean them until the summer of 2002. So we were there for the entire school year with the air system running. And I should note that they were informed that they had to close the windows because the air outside was not safe. And so we were just breathing recirculated World Trade Center air all day, every day. It smelled like smoke in the building for the entire length of that time. Like it was just like very visibly and clearly unsafe. And the entire year, they basically denied that what was happening in front of our eyes was happening.
So they're gaslighting you.
Totally. And they did the same thing to the other schools when they finally returned, but they at least waited until the fires were out. I think the big distinction with Stuyvesant is we went back before the fires were burned out. And so we were there for months of fires.
So what did that experience do to your trust in, like, our system and in our government?
It certainly has allowed me to approach public health advice with a critical eye. I think I realize that a lot of time public health advice is often geared to protecting sort of the economy or broad concerns over your personal concerns. And so a lot of the time I think, especially, I thought about this a lot during COVID, some of the broad public health advice that you get during a crisis, and not even during a crisis, but really in the aftermath of a crisis, when people start to ask the question, when is this going to be over? When can we go back to normal? And waiting, like impatiently awaiting a normal that is never going to return. That sometimes the advice that you get is not necessarily geared to your specific circumstance, but is really more about other concerns that don't have anything to do with you. So while I think, I mean, it gave me an appreciation for how important public health authorities really are,
Mhm.
because a properly functioning public health response to 9/11 could have saved lives in a really meaningful way to people like me who are, we are now accustomed, those of us in the 9/11 advocacy space, we're accustomed to losing people all the time to really virulent cancers and to, bizarre health concerns that we've never even heard of before. And I think a proper public health response that values people's lives over economic concerns, and that prioritizes the safety of communities over the sort of narrative of a disaster is life saving. And so an incredibly important position. Emergency communications are an incredibly important job that I think are frequently undervalued. So I think on both sides, I sort of ended up with a healthy distrust of how public health authorities have been operating, but also a real appreciation for what good public health advice can do for a community.
Do you think that your experience with the aftermath of 9/11 affected how you received information from the COVID? Like, when the vaccine came out.
I think absolutely. And I think that the most important thing that I learned from 9/11 that I applied to my to how I thought about the COVID response was that after a big disaster, you don't expect things to go back to normal. So you don't wait for that to happen. I think a lot of my friends got and continue to get lulled into this sense that like they have to go and do things that are inherently risky because normalcy is so important and we've got to get back to normal. We got to get things back on track. And like after 9/11, nothing ever went back to normal for me. It's not like this a big thing like that can happen and you can just like later at some mystery point in the future resume your life. And the same is true of COVID. I me and a lot of other members of the 9/11 community are incredibly high risk for COVID because of our 9/11 exposures. And so we have to, I think, act with a certain amount of care that other people maybe don't feel that they have to. But we're also aware that one disaster can ruin your health forever. So I think like when I think about, how I took in the COVID crisis and what I chose to do with the information that I got during that crisis, I wouldn't say, I wasn't like somebody who was like inherently distrustful of the vaccine or anything like that. I was aware that everything was going to be a work in progress. So I was aware that like the, likely the vaccine would not be perfect on the first round, but also it was worth taking any precaution that I could take
Right.
because any precaution would minimize my risk. I still mask everywhere in public and indoor environments because I am aware that, after a big crisis like that, your habits have to change. And so I was very careful early on to get into the habit of masking indoors, knowing that that was likely going to be our reality for a long time, especially those of us with compromised health. And that we were not going to get the luxury of going back to whatever normal was before the COVID crisis began. I think it can be really like I think heartbreaking for people to come to that realization. And so I think a lot of people choose not to.
Right.
And that was true after 9/11 as well. It took maybe, it took almost 20 years for a lot of even my close friends to admit that the work that I had been doing was necessary
Hmm.
because they wanted to believe that like the real victims of 9/11 were somebody else that wasn't them and that they didn't have to worry about health risks and that they shouldn't have to, be part of any sort of public health program and that they wanted to believe that they were like different than first responders or different than those community members that had to clean their homes themselves or whatever it was, and then it turned out that they were ultimately going to have to admit that they weren't. So it's easier I think to admit early on that things are going to change than to have that realization 20 years later when you realize you've been not taking care of yourself for 20 years.
Do you think that they came to realize that because there were numbers to prove it?
That definitely. I also think that, and I think this is where, advocacy work can be really valuable in terms of creating a public narrative around an event that people are just like not interested in uh, addressing. But I think when they saw that I was acting as the chief survivor advocate during the 2019 advocacy efforts,
Mhm.
I had been involved in all of the advocacy efforts for the Zadroga Act up until that point. But I was put in a different kind of position in 2019 because we needed a bill that would go until 2090, and someone needed to explain why that was necessary when a bunch of like middle-aged men were coming and advocating for it. And
Right.
so the survivor community had to kind of remind America that there were young people that were exposed to the 9/11 cleanup as well. And I think when they saw me in that position, suddenly they were like, "Wait, is this real? Wait, like I was just presuming that like Lila was on some sort of adventure for herself. But like is this like a thing I should be like paying attention to because it seems like she's there with all the people that I took seriously this whole time." Like so I think that there was some value also in having our specific story elevated into the national narrative around 9/11, even for a brief time, that helped people realize that they should be taking care of themselves, not just that this was like a vague story of patriotic concern, you know?
Right, yeah, and the 2019, you testified with Jon Stewart and a bunch of people, but were you the only one advocating for survivors, or were there
Yeah.
other people there too? Okay, wow.
I was the only survivor that was invited to testify at that hearing. And I would note that the survivor community is 3 to 4 times the size of the responder community. So
Yeah.
it's a huge number of people, and it's a very under researched community. It's also a community that doesn't get the same benefits in the World Trade Center health program that responders do. It's much harder to access benefits as a survivor, and that was intentionally designed that way. And part of it was because there was not research to validate a lot of our concerns,
Mm,
and there's also, so the way that it works is that survivors have to already present with a 9/11 health condition to become a part of the research cohort for that
mm,
program and to get treatment in that program. Responders can get monitoring once a year to find out if they have a 9/11 related condition, and also that functions to provide a data set to see what people are getting sick with in the World Trade Center community. But responders are 90% male, so a lot of women's health concerns are not represented in that research at all. We in 20, I think it was 2021, 2022. It was very recent. No, it was last year that it finally passed. But the only cancer that was not covered by the World Trade Center Health Program, the only one, was uterine cancer. And they
wha
just kept being like, well, we don't have any data to back up that it's linked. And it was like, but you have data to back up that cervical cancer is linked, and every male reproductive cancer is linked, and also every other cancer on earth is linked, but just uterine cancer, we don't have the data. And it's like, well, no one has the data because no one has ever researched women's health. So there's no data on
seriously?
uterine cancer. They were referencing some study from Italy in the 60s to make the case. And it was like, well, there's no other research to reference. And that's why we can't link it. And so, there are a lot of weird gaps like that that occur because the survivor community doesn't get to participate in the kind of baseline research that the program does. And then there's a separate data set that the New York City Department of Health has that is the longest longitudinal study of 9/11 community members, and that includes survivors as well. But young people are very underrepresented in that data set, and also it's a self-report study, so they have a high attrition rate because people don't want to fill out a really depressing survey about their 9/11 health concerns,
Right.
every few years. And so there's, just like there are a lot of ways in which the survivor community has both not been given the opportunity to even present our case to, not even just to America, but to each other. And then also a lot of ways in which we don't even get access to services that we probably deserve because of that. I mean, I've learned a lot about the politics of medical research in the process of this, and that's
Interesting.
weird for me because I'm a writer. I'm not a great scientific mind of any sort,
Right.
but I've learned a lot about what, biases within the medical community can do to what seems like, just scientific research that has, no agenda of any sort. If you don't include women in your study, then you won't find out how things affect women, and then you will be in the position we're in now, where like every drug on the market is like dangerous for women in some way, but no one found out about it.
It's
Like,
like a birth control, for example,
well,
like
exactly.
that.
Yeah, there's a ton of that if you start watching for it, but
Right.
I didn't know to watch for it until I started doing this work. So
Yeah, and I mean, just in general, getting anything done in Washington is so hard. So I was curious, like, what was your experience down there?
yeah, I was very lucky, I think, to grow up in a family where I was kind of given the tools to do this kind of advocacy project from a young age. My mom used to take me to Washington when I was a kid. And when we were there, because we just had friends there, we would always go visit our representatives. We would always, she always made sure that I knew that Congress was open to the public, that the halls of Congress are open to the public, and that I am entitled to go and visit my representatives if I want to. And so I kind of had a leg up, I think, on a lot of my friends because of that. And I think that that is kind of what enabled me to even start thinking about doing this kind of advocacy work in the first place. Is I did not think of it as like some great group project that I was getting involved in. In 2006, I found out that, a first responder had died of his 9/11 cleanup exposures. I realized that I had been at the 9/11 cleanup as well, and I just got mad about it. And so I just started complaining to politicians when I would see them at things. And it kind of like took on, a life of its own. And so initially, me and some classmates would go down to Washington by ourselves and go and just let representatives know that there were all these young people that were not only at the site, but also had not been residents of the community, and so weren't necessarily being communicated with by, our local congressman's office or whatever, like that we had been kind of a dispersed population inherently, and that we were only getting more dispersed because we had all then gone off to college. And then, New York City costs $1 billion to live in. And so a lot of us had left New York City. And so there was this kind of community of young adults who had, no voice in the 9/11 conversation. And then eventually we started going down with other groups. So we started going down with other survivor groups. We started going down with responder groups. And I think that there were initially two kind of like warring bills for a World Trade Center health program of some sort. And so we would all go down to support with the bill that we were excited about, which was confusing anyway. But then when they finally coalesced around one piece of legislation, we started all going down in larger groups. And I started going down to Washington with the Feel Good Foundation from time to time, or meeting the Feel Good Foundation down there, because they did a very organized advocacy effort around the Zidroga Act, and in a way that I learned a lot from them. It was a really impressive showing. I think one of the nice things about the responder community is because they were inherently kind of organized anyway, because they were part of professional organizations that made them feel a responsibility towards each other. They were able to get huge groups of people down to Washington really effectively. And so I started joining them when I could in Washington, because they were doing such effective organizing down there, and kind of chiming in where I could to be like, and if you think that was bad, imagine the children. And what I kind of quickly realized is that it's very hard to be a woman on the Hill. It's very hard to be a young woman on the Hill. I had to kind of think about the theater of that more than I really wanted to. And so there were certain things I learned over time, like I realized it didn't really benefit me to dress professionally because I looked like a staffer. And so people would ignore me if I was dressed professionally. So I started wearing jeans and t-shirts down to, what in the Feel Good Foundation always dresses in either uniforms or in matching polos or whatever. They always look very organized. But I was like, I need to stand out here in some way. I need to make it clear that I'm not someone who came along for the ride or is working. I need to make it clear that I am an advocate as well. And I have to do that in a way that seems contradictory, but like, actually, I'm there to advocate for young people, so it's okay to look young. And then I also realized that I was getting a lot more mileage out of having first responders tee up my story for me, than
Mm.
I was just by telling it. And so I started kind of lobbying them almost. I would, in between office visits, I would kind of like talk to them about what the experience of 9/11 students had been in particular, and the rest of the 9/11 survivor community, and kind of ask them to pepper that into their own, conversation with congressional offices and Senate offices, because it really helped set the scene for me, so that when I finally did get a chance to speak, I was being taken seriously. It was a long learning curve, and I went on a lot of trips where I feel like I was just like flat out ignored. Like I've had so many politicians shake everyone's hand but mine in a line of people that I can't even express. I've had so many people ask if my dad is a first responder. I was used to that question because I live in California most of the year, and that is frequently what people outside of New York City understand to be the experience of 9/11, is that it was just first responders, and they don't see how someone like me could fit into that. But um, but the process of figuring out where and how to be an effective advocate, like on the Hill as a young woman in particular, was very complicated. And I think also no one really talks about it, because I think it's kind of like we don't want to sort of admit that that kind of thing is, central to the experience of women on the Hill, and specifically central to the experience of young women on the Hill and young people on the Hill in general. And so so I kind of had to I had to kind of troubleshoot a lot of it myself, which I think has made me a more effective advocate. I certainly, I think, ended up with a more creative approach to advocacy than a lot of other people would, um but it was like a, a 15-year learning curve.
That's so crazy. Like, do you think that people took it more seriously when first responders said it because they were first responders, or men, or both?
I think both. I think you hear a man in uniform say something, you're more likely to take that seriously. I think that I mean, this is something that I've thought about a lot since that kind of 2019 chapter closed. And I wrote something about it with another organization at one point, because I was so kind of interested in it. Is we are really invested in like wartime framings of disasters. So the only way that we really have to like understand the the aftermath of a big crisis is through kind of like a heroes and victims
Hmm.
dichotomy. And so I think, we are not a nation that inherently thinks that like victims are necessarily deserving. We sort of want to celebrate the people that we feel like did something, but the kinds of acts that we elevate after a crisis are like often kind of war acts. So it's like someone pulling someone out of rubble and lifting a heavy thing and like rescuing someone with their, bare hands and like that kind of stuff. And a lot of the heroic acts that are narratives that women have access to are demoted in these stories. It's like I also think it was pretty heroic that like a bunch of teachers came into like a burning environment to make sure that kids continue to get an education. I
Right.
think it's like pretty heroic that like an entire community of women stepped up to advocate for that community, because when you look at who advocated for the community most aggressively, it was women. It started with mothers. It always does. When you think about any community that faces a crisis, whether it be environmental, whether it be an act of mass violence, it is always mothers that step up, and we inherently devalue their contribution to to the advocacy piece of a crisis, because we're so used to devaluing how women participate in society. And so I think that like 9/11 had sort of the perfect dichotomy there, because it was like we had these like men in uniform who rushed into a dangerous environment and like did truly heroic acts. But then on the other hand, we had an entire community of women who also stepped up in their own way and were completely ignored, because that doesn't really fit into like a wartime framing of a disaster. So we were sort of like, that's just like what women do. They're supposed to do that. Like
Right.
men come and save us, but when women save you, it's because they were supposed to. It's
It's
invisible.
it's so crazy. I was talking to someone and we were talking about, first responders going to the pile, but for each first responder, there's like 10 women who's like cleaning them off or getting them food or like, then you don't
Right.
talk about that. And
Taking
that's,
care of their children,
yeah.
making sure, like figuring out how to keep the children of the community off the pile. I mean, whatever it is,
Right.
like there's there's always a community of women in a crisis that don't get the same adulation that the community of men who also do heroic acts do. And I think one thing that I've always found really interesting is like I am very clear that like on 9/11 itself, I was the opposite of heroic. I had actually, that third floor room that I had retreated to was the nurse's office. There was a school for disabled kids inside of Stuyvesant, and they had brought all of their students there. So there were all these kids with severe developmental disabilities in wheelchairs in that room. And when we were called to evacuate, I just bolted on them. I did not help a single person evacuate the building. I was so terrified for myself that I did not think straight. And so I was whatever the opposite of being a hero in that context was, is what I was. And then I spent 20 years trying to make sure that my entire community would be protected from the aftermath of these events. And I think that is its own kind of heroic act. But the only people I've ever heard describe that as heroic are first responders. I've never heard a regular person describe that as heroic. And I think that's so interesting. It was like they had to be, it could only come from them because they're the real heroes. So, like, no one would dare call any of these other acts heroic, because they don't meet this sort of wartime criteria for what heroism is, which is something you have to have big muscles to do. Like,
Right. Yeah, like what we've been taught through movies and Hollywood and all of
yeah.
that. It's like not the same. But so within that 20 years after, can you talk a little bit about your company and like what that entails
Organization.
now? Yeah, organization, sorry.
Yeah. I wish it was a company, because then maybe I would make money doing it. So a lot of what we do, we sort of focus on two things. One is that we focus on advocacy. So that's advocacy both to, for on the legislative end to make sure that we are protected legislatively, but also advocacy to the programs that got established by that legislation to make sure that they're serving this community, because we have kind of unique needs. We're nationally dispersed in a way that first responders are, but most of the survivor community is not. So like, the program, the World Trade Center Health Program, which was founded by the Droga Act, it has a national component, and then it also has like these clinics in New York City. And most survivors get seen through those clinics in New York City. And our community is very frequently seen by the national network, and it's a much more complicated system, and we have very unique needs within it. And so we do advocacy to those programs. And then the other thing we do is we do advocacy for those programs. We do outreach for those programs to make sure that other survivor community members A, know that they are survivor community members. It is wild how many people in the survivor community don't know that they were affected by 9/11 and have been like sitting around with 9/11 related health conditions being like, I wonder why I have asthma now. And I, and like getting diagnosed with cancers. It's often a cancer diagnosis that will lead people into the program because suddenly they're like, well, wait a minute, should I be 25 with cancer though? Like,
Right.
I think that is often serious enough that it kind of triggers that response. But so we do outreach to members of the survivor community to let them know what health resources are available to them, to let them know that there's compensation available to them, and that these things that they've been hearing about with the responder community, that they have access to a lot of them as well.
That's amazing, and you also wrote a book.
I did.
That's a big deal. I ordered it and it hasn't arrived yet, but I read everything I could possibly read on the internet available. I was curious when I was reading it, did you include any of the, like, things you learned being a woman on the Hill?
There are two things that are in the book that I felt like were the central things that I wanted to include. One was I wanted to include the story of 9/11 as it happened to students to validate that this was a serious exposure, that it was an enormous lapse in public health um, protection, and that when you hear survivors making claims to these programs and you don't really understand what the survivor experience was, that these claims are valid, that we were mistreated after 9/11, and that our exposures were quite serious, because I think that's not well understood even in Washington, even
Right.
even when I've explained it in person. And then the other piece was I wanted to make sure other people had the tools to advocate for themselves in this way. Um, and and so I have sort of the book A. It's not a really somber, depressing account of 9/11. A lot of the sort of weird and inconvenient things about being in this position that are funny thoughts that you have when you're in a crisis, like I include all of that specifically so that it is readable and fun to read. And I work in television in real life. Like, I wanted to make sure that the book was engaging and a fun read, and not just because so many books about 9/11 are like unreadably somber, and I
Right,
really struggle with the kind of like level of bagpipiness that goes on, when we have conversations around 9/11, because it makes it hard for a lot of people to engage in them. But
right,
also, there are so many young people that are in similar kinds of, you know, crises, whether they be environmental, acts of mass violence at their schools. I mean, there's like a COVID, there's a million other ways in which you can have a crisis when you're a young adult. And so I was also really careful to include like everything that I thought would be useful to someone who might want to advocate for themselves. So I don't want to kind of like tell the story of like some, to make myself seem like I'm some kind of larger than life figure who had some brilliant understanding of politics and like did something no one else could do. Like what I did, everyone can do. And I would rather they do it more efficiently than me. And so I made sure to include all of the things that would be useful to somebody who is looking to do something like this for themselves. And also talked a little bit, I talk about how it affected my outside life. I talk about, one of my great frustrations is the presumption that this should become my sole identity and my sole career. This is the worst day of my life. I don't want to engage with it 24/7. I don't want to engage with other people's 9/11 stories 24/7. I think that's fair. And I think that there's this pressure to kind of like turn yourself into a professional victim when you experience something like this and you get involved in advocacy work around it. And I've been very careful to keep a career separate from this 9/11 work because it's the only thing that like enables me to do it. And I think if I had listened to other people, talk about how I should approach my advocacy work, it would have become all consuming so quickly and I would have quit within a year. So
yeah.
I'm very kind of like, I try to kind of lay out like a livable version of doing this kind of work as well, so that it doesn't seem like it's, impossible to do for other people.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I'm gonna leave the link to the book in the description of the episode because I'm so excited to read it. Because I mean, even just what you said of like what you learned on the Hill is so important, and I think that clearly more women should go and fight for the
Yeah.
things that are needed. But I wanted to ask, kind of, you've learned so much throughout this time. Is there one thing that's most impactful to you that you have learned?
Oh, interesting. I think that I have an answer that is not an answer that maybe other people involved in advocacy work would want me to give, because I think I think people take this as devaluing the work, and I don't think that's what it does. But like, advocacy is theater,
Mhm.
politics is theater, all of it is theater. And I think that one of the lessons that it took me years to learn, that I wish I had known from the beginning and had been able to just be, honest about, is that doing this kind of work requires you to think about how you're being perceived. It requires you to sometimes dress a certain way, to act a certain way, in a way that is like a little hammy. It's like you have to perform a lot of the time. And not because the performance is insincere, but I think a lot, I think in order to be perceived as reasonable, oftentimes, and I think especially women are taught to kind of like downplay the theater of what has
Right.
happened to them as victims advocates. And when you look at effective advocacy work that actually accomplishes things, it is often done by people who have embraced that this is theater. If you think about what actually moves a legislative agenda, it is often something that has made a splash in the media. It has made an emotional connection to the people who are going to vote on it. Like, I think one of the things that was interesting about my testimony was that it didn't get covered in media. It didn't get, it was not the Jon Stewart testimony. I get why, that overshadowed everything. But young women on the Hill kept coming up to me and being like, I talked to my boss about this because of your testimony. Like, it I thought I was very careful to think about like who my testimony could connect with in the room, and who I was aiming to talk to there. And just those kinds of considerations. And that's why I started wearing jeans on the Hill. That's why I started lobbying first responders. It's like, I'm inherently kind of like a cheerful person, and I leaned into that in part because I saw that it was like a contrast to what responders were doing, and it allowed me to engage some people that really couldn't kind of engage with what responders were saying because it was so sad. And to not admit that that's like 90% of advocacy work is like the sort of theatrical component of it, is to is to miss like a huge opportunity to be effective. And so
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that I most learned, and the thing also that people who do this professionally don't want you to know, because they want you to think that advocacy work is like so serious that not everyone can do it, that you need professionals. But
Well, it's crazy, like, when you think about it, like, you were essentially a director of a play. Like, you
yeah.
lobbied the first responders to get them to do what you needed to effectively accomplish the goal, which is so
Yeah, and
crazy.
not in like a duplicitous way. It was like, I think a lot of, when I say that it's theater, a
Yeah,
lot of people take that to be that I was being dishonest or whatever. But it was
right,
just like they wanted to help. So they wanted to do what would be helpful.
right.
I needed to think to myself, okay, like how can we most effectively communicate a fact that no one wants to hear, which is that there are kids from 9/11, that were affected by 9/11. And who can most effectively convey that fact to the people that need to hear it? And like that kind of strategizing is inherent to any effective advocacy campaign, but people don't sort of people don't admit that a lot of the time.
Right, yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay, I have 3 more questions for you, and
Okay.
they're more uplifting, I hope.
Perfect.
Number 1, what is the most beautiful thing you've learned doing the advocacy work?
I feel like one of the things that has been the most enriching about this work is that I have developed like close relationships with a lot of people that I would never have crossed paths with in real life. Like, I have like a sort of a very strong community of like former cops and firemen and iron workers, and like I feel like that has been an interesting part of this work that has been really rewarding, because a lot of these are, people I don't share political views with a lot of them. I don't share, certainly, any kind of like common life things with any of them. But we share this one thing, and we've spent years together, and it's kind of given me an opportunity to like, to a realize that you can do advocacy work with people that you don't agree with politically a lot of the time. If you have a common goal, you can find common ground. um and that's a useful skill and a useful thing to know, and it also helps you just like not demonize people that you don't agree with politically on things, and kind of realize that like everyone is just people. But so I think that's been really rewarding. I think it's really like informed my ability to talk to people from other walks of life about politics. I mean, I people now always remark that I can sort of talk about politics with anyone. without everyone getting angry. And
That's a skill.
that's a skill that I think I learned doing this work. And that has been like a really useful skill to have. And also, it has allowed me to keep my Uber and Lyft score very high as a passenger because I often talk about politics and Lyfts and Ubers, and I know how to do it in a way that doesn't make me a terrible passenger.
Can that be
But I
your
think
next
that,
book, though? Can you write
yeah,
that?
I probably, it should be. But yeah, well, and it's also, I think I feel very strongly that this work is requires me to pay forward some of these things. So like I think a lot of the time the 9/11 community can be very insular because 9/11 is this thing that exists as a sort of once in a lifetime big event in all of our imaginations. And the last chapter of my book is about this a little bit, but like the fact that your crisis was not elevated to national attention does not mean it was not a crisis to you, and it does not mean that some of the things that we did in response to 9/11 can't be lessons that you take into your sort of personal crisis. So I think that, to me, like it's important that 9/11, the story of 9/11, not just exist in the past, but also that we think about how it's connected to other disasters. I do that, I've been trying to really do that around the COVID crisis because there are so many clear connections, but I see so many connections to, sort of any level of environmental crisis, because ultimately what affected our health as 9/11 survivors and as students at Stuyvesant was a health crisis, an environmental health crisis. It wasn't really about a terrorist attack. That was just what prompted this environmental health crisis. So I think that there's like ways that when you have a successful advocacy campaign that you are like obligated to pay that information forward. And I feel like that's also a really enjoyable thing to do because it feels good to like be able to like provide useful information to other people who are dealing with a crisis.
I love that. Um, okay, number 2, what is giving you the most energy right now?
Great question. Um, I don't know. I'm in an energy low point because I've been dealing with a with an apartment crisis recently. But I think I feel really optimistic about like Gen Z's own advocacy. I think that a lot of people my age can get very like down on Gen Z because they have changed work culture in a way that we were taught to just be workaholics and be thankful for it, and they
Right.
are kind of like, should we be workaholics? And I don't want to be a workaholic. So I feel like a lot of the conversations that they're having around, really any issue that just like allows you to like exist in society without being constantly harassed. And then also around how we want to fit work into our lives, how we want to balance our lives. Like I think these are all such important conversations. I think my generation was not in a position to have them. And I'm kind of like, I feel like they're making work and life better for all of us. So I feel like young people right now are like, and they'll turn into old people and they'll become annoying, of course, as we all do. Um but right now are like really are really like providing benefits to all of us that people my age should be thankful that someone is raising the
No,
concerns around,
it's so true. So I have 2 sisters and they're 11 years younger than me. So I'm millennial, they're Gen Z, and it's so
Oh, yeah.
funny to watch how different we are in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. And like they just sent me like a TikTok or something. It was like they're clocked out at 5 p.m. at work. And like that like doesn't matter
Right.
what's happening. There could be a crisis. They'd be like, "No, all right, it's 5 p.m." And I'm like,
Right.
"I love that. That's
Right.
amazing."
Like, should we all not be doing that? But I feel like I hear so many people my age be like down on them because they have Gen Z people working for them at this point.
Yeah.
And I I'm like, we should all learn from their examples.
Seriously, we should like start being more European where we take naps in the
Yes,
middle of the day, you know?
absolutely. Yeah.
All right, last one. What's something exciting you have planned for this year
Something exciting that I have planned for this year.
with the organization or with your writing?
I have a talk at a school coming up, and I feel like one of the things that I like to do the most is speak to teenagers about this experience. A, because if you're a teenager right now, like you likely read about 9/11 in a book and you were like, that happened in history.
Right.
Whatever, who cares? But and I don't necessarily disagree because like, your life in your life 9/11 has always already happened. And I feel the
Right.
same way about like the Kennedy assassination. Like my parents always talked about that like it was transformative and it was like, well, for me Kennedy has always been assassinated. So like
Right.
that's like a that's just like a thing that has always been the case. But I love to talk to teenagers about what my experience on 9/11 was because I think that there are so many ways in which they can use that information to think about how they want to advocate for themselves. And I think a lot of the time, the story of 9/11 is devoid of like regular people, especially if you hear just like a rushed version of it. You're like, well, of course, I don't care about this thing because it's just like another war thing that happened in like history or whatever. But but I think if you can hear about a major historic event, and it is weird to have things like museums dedicated to a thing you lived through. Like it's weird to be only 40 and have all of this mythology built up around a thing that you were a teenager for.
Right.
Um, but I feel like also it kind of helps connect what is valuable about learning about 9/11 to teenagers in a way that I think that the story itself often doesn't. It feels like a sort of thing that is like a like lost in history that has nothing to do with them. And I think you should really seek to make any major historical event that like changed the entire like context of of the history class you're taking. You should figure out how teenagers might care about it, like what connects to teenagers about that story. And so I think I always really love talking to kids about it, and so I'm excited that I have at least one event on the books. I'm hoping more because that's always fun.
That's really cool. I'm gonna list your book link, your website link in the description. But really, thank you so much for honestly everything you do. I am so inspired by you, and so many other people are too. And so, yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.